closely with the Travel Foundation, with UN Tourism, and many others. I'm joined by Bobby Chubigby, who is the lead author of the report that we're about to talk about, and is a research fellow at the University of Waterloo in Canada. The third author, Freya Higgins-Debiol, is with us too in person in the audience, but it's extremely late in Australia, so she is sitting back and watching and letting us do the talking, so thanks for that, Freya. Bobby and I are going to start things off with a brief presentation to introduce the report, explain what it's about and why we feel that it matters so much. The report is freely available and always will be at climatejusticintourism.org. Don't worry about trying to remember that. It will be shared in the chat and you can click and there we go. Thank you nicely. And you can download your own copy of the report for free. Once we've made a short presentation, Marco Lucero from Cuidadores de Destinos in Chile, who is one of the project partners, will hold a discussion with our three expert panelists, all of whom may be familiar to you. We have Amanda Charles, the Sustainable Tourism Specialist at the Caribbean Tourism Organization. Amanda heads up their Sustainable Tourism Division. Judy Kefagona, who is founder of STTA, Sustainable Travel and Tourism Africa, and based in Kenya. And for over 20 years, Judy has championed a just, inclusive, sustainable tourism model across the continent of Africa and beyond. And last but by no means least, Gopinath Gopi Parial is an Indian social entrepreneur and founder of the Kerala tourism company, the Blue Yonder, which is a tour company that has long put climate justice at the heart of its mission. Please use the chat to comment on the discussion, share links, ask your questions. Kate from the Travel Foundation is monitoring that chat and will add questions to Marco to bring into the debate at the end. And we do understand this is a challenging topic and may well be unexplored issues for many people. So please feel free and feel encouraged to speak and to ask any questions that you want. It is absolutely essential if we are to deliver meaningful, inclusive climate justice that we listen to each other and give each other space to be heard. With that, I hand over a few minutes later than planned to Bobby to start telling us all about the presentation. Thank you, Bobby. All yours.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for the introduction. Perfect. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone around the world. And thank you so much for joining us for this very important discussion. And so I'm just very excited to be able to launch in today because I think that, you know, through many of the voices that we canvassed for the report, but the voices that are also joining us here today, we're all very, very painfully and viscerally aware that this topic is just so timely. And, you know, for really all of our human experience, but particularly for this industry and this endeavor that we call tourism and travel. So we kind of start out by, you know, with the most recent IPCC report that says climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people that are unequally distributed across systems, regions, and sectors. And so this is our reality now. It's no longer a projection, even though we continue to have very alarming projections of how much worse and widespread and multi-layered things are going to become. But I think that this, you know, reality that we're all facing, whether we're coming in talking from Kerala or from Santiago, Chile, or from where I'm addressing you all today here in Oklahoma on the Muskogee Creek Reservation, we're all seeing this in real time and we're all seeing how it's impacting tourism. And so this was the impetus really behind this report that we've put together over this past year and a half that really tries to explore what the concept of climate justice can and perhaps should look like for travel and tourism. We aim to provide some concrete examples, guidance, but really a starting point for this conversation in trying to address climate justice And in doing that, we're very proud that our methodology has been first and foremost attempting to include as many voices of experts from around the world. And when we talk about experts, we're talking about not just CEOs and people who are in academia or the conventional experts, but we're talking about leaders of communities that are most vulnerable and affected. And we're talking about tourism business leaders. So if we could go on to this next slide, please. So when we're talking about this topic of climate justice, what we had found most helpful in the report is really starting out with some basic definitions, because in this environment where things are radically changing so fast, it's just important to be able to kind of start out on a shared ground of understanding. So I think that we've become very familiar with climate change and the multitude of ways in which it happens throughout the world. And what I think that we've come to see, not just through tourism, but through all industries, is really our response thus far to a lot of the climate change impacts has been through climate action. And so we have defined this in our report as strategies and efforts taken to reduce or eliminate carbon emissions, as well as adjust to the multitude of crises presented by climate change. So this encompasses what we commonly talk about of decarbonization, carbon accounting, mitigation, and adaptation, which is important, valid, and work that still needs to be going. What we are trying to address in this report is bringing in, unsettling this narrative and saying that this is not giving the full picture when we're simply counting carbon, or when we're simply talking about that electrification and electric vehicles are the solution to the carbon emissions and the warming it's caused. We need to begin to apply a deeper understanding of justice, of how these climate impacts are impacting our human communities and our more than human, our animal relatives, plant relatives, and the ecosystems upon which we depend and which tourism depends on. So in our report, we define climate justice as when climate-related decisions, actions, and inactions negatively impact the least responsible and the most vulnerable to those climate crises. Climate justice also encompasses a focus on the leadership and capacities of these impacted communities, recognizing that certain places, communities, and groups of people have unequal responsibilities in their historical and current carbon emissions. So this is just the important starting place for us in this project, is really unsettling the narrative of just looking at climate and carbon and saying that we need to start with a foundation of critical justice. If we could have the next slide, please. If we could have the next slide whenever you're ready. Thank you. So in our report, based on really the conversations that we had with our expert informants from across the globe, as well as really canvassing the literature in both industry and academia, we really kind of distilled some of the two most important takeaways into two large points that we'd like to share here. So number one is fair action on emissions. So what does this mean? Well, tourism is, we're all very aware that, you require, it requires mobility and transportation. And so, when we're speaking honestly about the link between tourism, travel, and the emissions that have caused climate change, we need to recognize and start out with the fact that tourism is responsible for between 8 to 10% of global emissions. But we also need to be aware of the fact that tourism emissions are disproportionately caused by a very small percentage of the global population that regularly engages in international travel. So you see here that this is what we're talking about when we say it is a 1% issue. If we could have the next slide. So we hear from Megan Morikawa, who had previously been of Iberostar Group and is on the Travel Foundation board. She says the individuals that are responsible for a large portion of those long-haul flights are a 1% issue. The privileged are the ones who are contributing disproportionately to emissions that are significant. So it's important to link and to ask this question of, okay, 8 to 10% of global emissions, but who is causing this? If we're wanting to really kind of pinpoint the source of this, we're needing to look at the demographics of where these emissions are coming from and not just looking at the vehicles that are producing them. If we can have the next slide. So this leads to the secondary point on talking about fair emissions, that thus the impacts from climate change are disproportionately felt by those who travel the least and cause the least emissions. So these two maps that we have up here are imperfect in a number of ways, but they do help to illustrate kind of some basic points about where we see some of the global hotspots for the climate risk. So in these areas, you see this map on the right, again, an oversimplification, but some of the key areas are low-lying island nations, sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Latin America, throughout South and Southeast Asia. But it certainly, you know, as we just kind of wake up and see the news today, you know, this also encompasses, you know, what we would refer to as the global north as well. Bushfires that are ravaging Canada and other parts of the northern hemisphere, bushfires that have been in Australia. So it really complicates you know, understandings that this is only impacting the global south, yet we do recognize that global south, these areas that I've kind of mentioned, are really at the forefront of feeling these impacts. Next slide. So this leads us to the second point that we make, our second takeaway, which is fair action on adaptation and resilience. And so here you see this same, as I said, you know, imperfect maps where we're kind of looking at some of the strongest impacts of the climate crisis hitting the global south. And if you superimpose that map onto the map of the that's on the right of which areas of the world really depend on tourism most strongly, you start to see a correlation. So the point that we make and that we heard again and again from the voices that we canvassed is that the places that are most severely impacted by climate change most consistently are often the ones that are most heavily reliant on inbound tourism. Next slide, please. We hear this very clearly from Christina Leala-Gale in the South Pacific. She says, in the Pacific, we're the furthest away from other countries. We're so isolated, and this requires long-haul travel to reach us. In speaking on behalf of the Pacific, we do not have the technology, resources, and access to greener energy for much of the tourism industry in this part of the world. So her words really begin to kind of embody this kind of multi-layered, connected web of challenges that are now faced, where, again, we're moving far beyond just carbon counting and even talking about climate crises, and seeing how this now has very complicated and intersecting social, economic, environmental impacts. Next slide. So this really leads us to this broader issue that we begin to invite a conversation on, where we you know, are saying that we need to be very wide-eyed and honest in talking about the enormous risks that tourism and travel face, but also the resilience, particularly coming from so many of these communities that have been under-resourced historically and in the present. So we refer to this in the report as kind of these layered, intersecting and compounding crises, a recognition that climate change impacts often compound and exacerbate existing socioeconomic inequities linked to tourism. This can include, you know, local communities' access to some of the most basic resources that we all need for survival, such as water, food prices, housing access. And so certain climate actions then have the potential to pose further challenges and inequities upon communities that are tourism dependent. So we highlight this word in the report where that kind of encompasses some of these compounding crises that specifically relate to the challenges that are posed for communities that are tourism dependent, but who are trying to engage in climate action. And we call this transition vulnerabilities, when some decarbonization and adaptation measures pose additional challenges to tourism reliant communities. I think the next slide, I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Brilliant, thank you, Bobby. Yes, Bobby has laid out many of the challenges that we go into greater detail in the report, many of which you'll be acutely aware of. But of course, this is a report calling for action and for what we can do and what is being done, what needs to be done, and what should be done. So we focus a sizable part of the report on reviewing the state of climate action across our industry. And what we see is that there's always been a focus on the need to support vulnerable communities, on the need for climate justice. I was involved closely in the launch and sort of early stages of Developing Tourism declares a climate emergency back in 2019. And the motivation for Developing Tourism declares wasn't for companies to meet their legal obligations. And it wasn't really about decarbonization so much as the very human response to witnessing Cyclone Kenneth destroy a lodge and ravage the community that was dependent upon it in northern Mozambique. It was grounded in a need for our industry to build a response based in justice and in risk. It was through that work that we were connected with Marco Lucero from Cuidadores, who will be hosting the panel discussion later. Marco came to the people of Tourism Declares and said, we need to make sure that the voices of Latin America, of the indigenous communities, is part of this. And that evolved Turismo Declara, broadening and embedding Tourism Declares work in climate justice. From Tourism Declares, that grew into what many of you will know, the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism, UN tourism-led initiative that is really now the industry framework for climate action, and that has 900 plus signatories from across the industry, across destinations, national level, down to individual consultants and activists. But you see the language there, I just put a small quote up from the original text of the declaration. It doesn't say the phrase climate justice, but it says climate change impacts are most severely felt by underrepresented and vulnerable groups, such as women, indigenous communities, people living with disabilities, and small island states. A just and inclusive transformation of tourism must prioritize their voices and needs, as well as those of the younger generations who will otherwise pay the full price of our inaction. We end up focusing when we talk about climate action on measurement, on decarbonization, on frameworks, on the technicalities of addressing climate, this challenge. And sometimes we get so fixated on those frameworks and challenges that we don't necessarily remember the very human reasons why we are doing this. And if climate justice feels overwhelming, another thing to add, it's important to remember that actually it's about reminding ourselves why we do this. We can go on to the next slide, please. We'd go into this in great detail in the report, but last year I spent a significant amount of time working with UN Tourism, reviewing published climate action plans so far, about 250 plans, to see what progress we are making as an industry and what more needs to be done. The report that was published is the image on the left, but in particular, looking at issues relevant to climate justice, we see that it's not that we're not doing anything. There's lots that we are doing as an industry that is great and that supports climate justice, but it isn't necessarily done explicitly so that we can do so. And there isn't necessarily this clear understanding and framing of vulnerable voices, of community at the heart of what we are doing. Likewise, very few plans contextualize their work inside of the risks that we are increasingly experiencing in our daily lives. And without understanding and relating to the risks, we may well be focusing on the wrong priorities. And one of the reasons for this is that plans are often created by the company or the destination who sets out to create it. But do they go and engage with the most vulnerable and impacted communities with whom they interact to understand their voices, their situations when developing a climate response? Because by contrast, what we see when we look at the plans that are the strongest climate justice focused, it does come from those who really do center impacted communities and focus on risk when working out how to develop their climate action. And these are the individual aspects that we can do. But what we see is a need to build up from just individual actions by individual companies towards how can we collaborate to something wider. If we move forward to the next slide, please, and I return to Bobby.
Thank you. So I think in starting to move towards, these deeper dialogues and, towards collective action that we think dream into being, that we think that we, dialogue into being, what we heard consistently through our interviews for the report, for, all of the research that we did, is really kind of the ethical approach that's required is deep and meaningful inclusion, collaboration, and systemic thinking, really across all areas of tourism operation, across all processes of creating travel products and experiences, that this really is represented in forging partnerships across sectors, that tourism has got to be able to speak outside of just our tourism and travel bubble, because we're interconnected with agriculture, with food systems, we're interconnected with health, with infrastructure, with all of these different things. And so it's, as Jeremy had been saying, it's really about broadening this discussion and trying to embed climate justice meaningfully into tourism strategies. And ultimately trying to adopt tourism practices that take a meaningful, holistic approach, that are addressing environmental, social, and economic considerations, not as an afterthought, not as a box-ticking exercise, but really as part of the initial and ongoing process. And so, we heard from Shivya Nath, who is another one of our voices. She says this: we need to re-examine the entire value chain in tourism to make sure that the opportunities and benefits that are created by this industry go down to the local communities, both in terms of ownership, which is a key word, ownership, and in terms of opportunity. And so if we could go on to the next slide, I think that with this framework and this foundation of an ethical approach that really centers inclusion, collaboration, and systemic thinking, I just wanted to be able to kind of briefly highlight some of the work that I've been doing before the report, but I think that really the direction this working with this report has launched me into, that when you begin to look at things holistically and move away from the carbon accounting, from just looking at things through a decarbonization lens and a climate change lens, you start to see some of the interconnections that happen. And so I just want to be able, on the picture on the right-hand side, to introduce you to the elder in my tribe in the Cherokee Nation, Rebecca Jim. For the past 35 years, she has led toxic tours across the northeastern part of our reservation, which unfortunately, as a result of over 100 years of lead and zinc mining, and then a total lack of cleanup on the part of the mining companies, has become one of the worst environmental hazard zones in the United States, where you have chat or heavy metal residue that are really the size of mountains. It's contaminated our streams and waterways. It's even contaminated the air. But I raise this example because I think that Rebecca is an incredible example of where we can start to take tourism and use tourism as a tool for what we are talking about fundamentally, which is really reconnecting to the living systems that give us life, upon which tourism is based. You know, being mentored by Rebecca, this has led me to other parts of the world, such as the pictures on the left, where I've gone to one of the largest lithium mines, hard rock lithium mines in Australia. And this is really important because, again, when we kind of speak in the mainstream way of the climate narrative, of looking at what's the problem, carbon, what's the solution, then automatically is, well, lessening emissions, and we need to rely on electrification. We need to apply this systemic thinking and ask ourselves, but what is required and who is that impacting, the human and the non-human? So this next slide, please. So by following just the path of lithium, which is key in all of our smartphones, the laptops that we're using right now, and for electric vehicles and what's proposed for, you know, electrifying aviation, what is required is a powdery white substance called lithium. And where that's coming from is not just Australia, as you saw in the picture before, but it's also coming from the lands where Marco is joining us today, from what's called now the Lithium Triangle in South America, where Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina intersect. And Marco and I, along with other colleagues, had the opportunity to be able to go to the heart of the Lithium Triangle this past spring, and to really see the impacts that it's having on indigenous communities, this lithium extraction, where, yes, you may not be counting as much in terms of carbon emissions anymore, but look at the impacts that are being had on the water cycle. That in the driest desert in the world, the Atacama Desert, they are now seeing inconsistent and less rainfall. This is impacting not just the indigenous traditional stewards who, you know, have been the stewards of this time of this place since time immemorial, but also the animals that are there, the Andean flamingo. And you see these flamingos, they pointed out to us that the flamingos are not the characteristic pink, but they're white because they're malnourished. With the less water, they're not finding as much to eat. And so you begin to start to see, when you apply this systemic thinking and include more voices that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of are relevant at the beginning, that this is a much, much broader problem than simply carbon, than simply that electric vehicles are the solution. And we need everyone here at the table and in the conversation. So I'll hand it over finally to Jeremy.
Thank you, Bobby. So I'm going to do this as quickly as possible because I really want us to now use the rest of the time and potentially go over time. And for those who are able to keep talking and keep listening, fantastic. This is a hard conversation to have in an hour. It expands, as Bobby just said, but the more you think about it, the more it connects, the more you need to qualify and to explain. Throughout the report, we pose questions. We don't just for 1 second suggest we have all the answers, but we feel that the conversations that we're trying to surface and center today and in other places aren't necessarily the conversations that are being had when they need to be had more often. There are questions that need to be being asked and conversations need to be had. We put 10 ideas for things that we feel should be risen up that could be much more systemically addressed, because through collaboration across our industry, there are real opportunities for tourism to truly engage in making a difference through collaborative climate action. I'll give you 3 examples. If you just go to the last slide before we then go into a conversation. 3 examples are, and I'm going to let Gopi, who is on here, undoubtedly talk about this far more, but our international supply chain, the network we have, where we find our hotels, the way we operate our businesses, means we are so often there at the crisis. And there's an opportunity for tourism not only to experience the crisis and to suffer from it, but to support communities when it happens. And Gopi knows this better than anyone else, and he'll be able to talk about it, I'm sure. Across destinations, we need to be looking at how we can develop pilots. We see in the responses to Glasgow Declaration that it's often destinations who are driving forward some of the most progressive, imaginative thinking. They aren't able to move their businesses. They will always be visit California, visit Vancouver, visit Kerala, because that's where they're based. So whatever the climate emergency brings to their place, they're going to have to deal with it. And they are there unavoidably and ideally placed to develop the pilots for how we can respond. And then that final thing is that what we are all experiencing is heightened risk, heightened impacts. But access to the data, access to the scenario planning, to those risk assessments isn't truly being shared. It's being kept by the corporations who are doing it, or inside of governments, or in technology that isn't truly being accessed. We all need access to the fullest understanding we can have of what the risks that affect the places we each call home. I'm going to pause there and hand over now to Marco, who's going to use up the rest of the time here to have a conversation with our three expert participants. And thank you so much for your time and for bearing with the technical challenges at the beginning. I hand over now to Marco.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Bobby, for talking us through the findings of the report. I'm going to share again on the group chat the link to download the report. So you can all download the report now. And just so you know, if you want to read the report in a more romantic language, you can also read it in Spanish. So you can download it in Spanish in that link. Well, thank you, Gopi. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Amanda, for being with us. Gopi, founder of the Blue Yonder. Amanda Charles from Caribbean Tourism Organization, and Judy Kepergona from Sustainable Tourism in Africa. I like to start with you, Amanda. I'm co-founder of Cuidadores de Destinos, based in Chile. In Chile, we depend on long-haul travel, so big emissions to get here. We are also a country very vulnerable to climate change. So Chile has 7 of the 9 criteria of vulnerability. So we are highly vulnerable to climate change. We are very aware, and we live every year extreme weather events. So we feel climate change on us, and we can see also how it affects most vulnerable communities. We are well aware, probably all of us, of the hurricane that hit planet Earth recently. It was very devastated, and I think if we talk money, it's 6.2 billion on damage, but most importantly, I think more than 60 people passed away because of this extreme weather event. So I want you to share a little bit on how is the situation maybe now, and is this report maybe touching your area of expertise? And thank you, Amanda, for being with us.
So thank you very much, and thanks to the Travel Foundation for extending an invitation to the Caribbean Tourism Organization to share some insights. I think this is a very important discussion in the context of climate justice, and certainly climate resilience is a priority for the Caribbean, given that the majority of our hazards are climate induced, in that we face an annual hurricane season. And as we know, it is projected that we will have a very active hurricane season this year. And it began quite early, July 1st, when a number of our countries, and in fact, 10 of our member countries were impacted by Hurricane Beryl, ranging from, at the time of impact, a category 3 to 5. And certainly St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada were most severely impacted by this hurricane. In St. Vincent, where there were 8 of the Grenadine Islands that were impacted, And traditionally, the Grenadines are the primary draws for visitors to St. Vincent. A lot of yachting, multi-million-dollar resort investments, and of course, a large number of the populace highly dependent on tourism for livelihoods. And all of that was decimated in about 2 hours, with at least 70% of the tourism supply for these Grenadine islands being severely impacted. In Grenada, we have the Grenadines of Carriacou and Petite Martinique that were again directly impacted, disrupting lives, livelihoods, and really threatening as well food security in coastal communities that also rely heavily on the fishery sector, with a lot of boats that incidentally serve both for fishing and tours, being, absolutely decimated. So we are looking towards recovery and supporting our member countries in the response efforts as well. At least 3,000 persons across the Grenadine Islands have been displaced, many homeless, some in shelters, and others sort of cohabitating with family members at this time. And the tourism sector plays an important role, in fact, because many hotels, given that, it is the traditional slow season in the region, many hotels have offered a percentage of their room stock, those that have not been impacted, to serve as temporary shelters. And again, that is really a critical role. One of the key challenges we've identified with the evolution of tourism, that really, in terms of accommodation, persons are seeking out, homestays. And one of our recommendations is, how do we ensure that governments have digital systems in place to be able to accurately have a record of foreign nationals that are in country and their location. That is critically important to save lives in the context of a rapid response to an impending disaster or a natural hazard such as a hurricane. And with that, I'll hand over to you.
Amanda, yeah, thank you so much, because this is definitely leading to Gopi, I think. Gopi, you are based in New York, but you work mostly in India, and India right now is suffering an extreme weather event, and you work particularly on this connection on tourism and humanitarian crisis. Can you maybe share a little bit with us and walk us through how are you doing it? This using tourism also as a tool to help in humanitarian crisis, and also how this report has touched you. You need to unmute yourself there.
Yeah, the whole idea of repurposing tourism resources and tool is actually not at all a rocket science, but unfortunately, we need to apply a lot of our brains to get it off the ground. So the reason how Blue Yonder is like, now this is our 20th anniversary. We started as a small soft adventure travel company looking into the cultural heritage of one river, Nila, where I'm from. But unfortunately, in the past 20 years, we have come across, as an organization, at least 10 major disasters, actually 11, including what is happening in Kerala since yesterday. Like yesterday, we had, just in single day, we had 294 rain, which is like 50 millimeter more than what happened in Dubai. Even in 2018 floods, we didn't have this much rain in a single day, right? So in 2018, the great floods of Kerala, we had 500 plus people who died. According to the government, the money that they needed to rebuild Kerala was about $5 billion. Interestingly, if you look at the turnover of Kerala tourism in 2018-19, that is also $5 billion. So you see the correlation, and like in most tourism dependent economy, like about 15%, 14 to 15% of our GDP comes from tourism. But now when I spoke about the 10 or 11 major disasters in the past 20 years, I'm talking only about those disasters where the average loss was about, say, $5 billion. Now, as Jeremy was just briefly mentioning, if you look at whatever the humanitarian sector needs during a crisis, be it shelter, accommodation, be it food and beverage with dignity. I'm not talking about something that you have to do airlift and throw to somebody. No, what I'm talking about is like warm, hot food that people are normally used to eating. You're not just giving them something that is available, but feed them what they are used to with dignity. And then if you look at the access to logistics, supply chain, the access to fleet and vehicles that we have in the tourism industry, or let's say the highly skilled human resources, like most of our adventure travel company, even soft adventure travel company, you have the basic skills to respond to a crisis because you apply that in your tourism business. You have a trekking company, that you have the skill set, how to do CPR, how to pick up people from trouble zones, all those stuff, right? And at the same time, we are also talking about the humanitarian sector desperately looking for funds. Like jokingly, we say, with friends in humanitarian sector, this is humanitarian sector is as small as a bubblegum industry. It's just $28-29 billion industry compared to our tourism industry, which is $9 trillion. So whatever the humanitarian sector needs during a crisis, or even the whole phase of disaster management, from mitigation, preparedness, response to recovery, this is all sitting idle with us. Why can't we work together in such a way that, and I'm not asking the tourism industry or my colleagues to do any charity. I'm not asking them to spend a little 2% of the CSR. No. What I am suggesting is that if communities are continuously, frequently badgered by natural disasters or man-made disasters or whatever you want to call and position it academically, climate change has literally hit the ceiling for us. Like my small business, often we wonder, why do we stay so small? It's not by choice. What happens is, unlike many travel companies, like for us, like every travel experience, I'm so proud to say that every travel experience that we offer has a project behind it. It's not just a tour of Taj Mahal, but it's like if we have a 3 hour of mangrove trail, there is a conservation project behind it. So the money that we spend in terms of creating a natural barrier in a place like Fort Kochi or nearby islands, that costs money to pay the volunteers, the activists, to buy the boats. It costs money. So we use tourism as a tool to recover that money that we spend. This is how we work. But then what happens is, even every year, for example, even if being a small company, we keep apart $7,000, $8,000 worth scholarships for the community members. Every year, even during the pandemic, we made sure that money is given to individuals who are doing beautiful work, but all it takes is one disaster like what happened in Kerala yesterday. All the hard work that is done is wiped out. But it also is a great opportunity right now to bring together all the stakeholders, what I would call as to set up live labs around the world. There are so many. We were just looking at a list of vulnerable locations, like easily you can pick up 20 to 50 destinations that desperately needs the coexistence, in the sense of what I call as a TDH, the tourism development and the humanitarian sector. It's high time we come together. Like the humanitarian sector, for example, they are also getting so tired. How often do you respond? There is a destination fatigue. It's always easy to say, I'm paying my tax, so this is the job of the government. But they are also getting tired. So it's so important that a multi-sectoral partnership needs to be brought together, and we all need to work together. And as I said earlier, we are not talking about CSR. We are not talking about anybody's charity. Like if you look at one company, 2E, it is like almost 85% is the size of the humanitarian sector. You know, so we have the resources. I'm not asking 2E or Blue Yonder to give all it has, but think very carefully in the sense of if destinations, whether it be, let it be Kerala or Barbados or Oklahoma, any place anywhere in the world, if it is continuously badgered by disasters, cyclone, drought, whatever it may be, if I'm a tour operator, if I am sending my travelers to these places, I'm going to think twice or more before sending another traveler there. But at the same time, when I know the reality is that climate change is not something as a photo opportunity for some politician to do some stunt to say that this is the crisis that we are going through, it's a reality everywhere. Like New York, you know, you get flash floods, you have slow onset disasters happening in DC, you know, you have all these things happening on a literally on a monthly basis now in my state in Kerala. So if I'm a tour operator sitting in London and sending my travelers because that's my core competency, I don't need to be in the destination to be affected. If I'm a tour operator, if my money is coming from a place like Kerala or some of the Caribbean islands, and if these places are constantly affected, it's affecting my business in the source market also. So it's not just someone else's business, it's everybody's business. So it's high time that we all come together, pick up, you know, we might not be able to replicate this everywhere in the beginning, but it's high time we pick up few destinations, identify the factors, you know, that make that live lab, identify the partners in the humanitarian sector, those tour operators. Like imagine the scenario if we train 1,000 taxi drivers in the city of Mumbai, one of the most populated cities in the world. When a flood happens, when a crisis happens, these guys are always in the field, consistently in the field. They are affected, but at the same time, such amazing resilience. So like Blue Yonder as a travel company, every year we give first responder training to our partners. You know, we never go around and say that, guys, we need to do charity, we need to save lives. No, we talk in the language that people understand, because if you have the skill set while running the business, it'll be handy. But at the same time, with the same skill, if you are an amazing kayaker, you can use your kayak or canoe as a search and rescue tool. You know, these are not rocket science, it's basic common sense, but unfortunately, our industry, common sense is not common. You know, so now we need to look everything from the perspective of ROI. This is the only language the big guys are going to understand. Like if Hilton or yes.
Yep. Thank you so much. And because we are over the time and because we started late, we are going to extend 10 more minutes, and we're gonna give some time to Judy as well to share with us her thoughts. But Gopi, that was a great intervention in inviting us all to collaborate. And I think it's important to say that we don't need rocket science. It's quite easy to get together and start working, doing things. Just a reminder that the report has many suggestions for businesses, destinations on what are the actions to take into account climate justice when thinking about climate action. So an invitation again to download the report. So Judy, you were a very inspired interview for this report. You inspired us all. You have a very inclusive approach when talking about tourism and sustainability and climate action. So I'd like your perspective, please, on this report and how this touches you, and what are your comments on the report? And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you. Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not able to turn on my video. The technology has failed me this afternoon, but I'm sitting in a beautiful place in Sabi Sabi in Mpumalanga, South Africa, looking at what tourism does for people and planet. This report is timely for the tourism industry, but I want to believe that the report is not just for tourism industry to act, It is for tourism industry. It has been said here by those who have spoken ahead of me. It's telling the tourism industry that you cannot do this alone, whereas you're a significant part of it. You cannot do this alone without everybody else in your supply chain, right? So this message must go out to everyone in the tourism supply chain. It must be broken down to the language of every segment of the supply chain. And we all know that language is a significant part of human interaction. Languages define cultures, languages connect people. And so I said it during the interviews that I think communities are disconnected from climate change because the language, most of the time, the global language that is spoken in high places and in many high-level conferences does not have their voice. It's not their language. It's not a language for survival and existence. They don't feel like it's a language for their survival and existence. It's a language for big time economics that takes place. So there is still a need, even with this report, that we must get to the point where climate action language makes sense to the people on the ground. And I know that there is also a lot of tourism businesses that are still struggling with understanding the language of climate and climate justice, but generally just understanding the language. Over the last 3 years, since the Glasgow Declaration, we've been supporting small businesses. I think on our database now, we have managed to onboard about 25 businesses to sign the declaration. But the amount of time that it has taken to support one business to understand, particularly the micro, small and medium enterprises, to understand this language, it's been enormous. And we've got one person dedicated trying to support businesses to understand this language. We just have one business that has, out of that 25, they have made the commitments, but we only have one that is in the process of doing an action plan. Now that tells you how this whole thing still remains very, very complex. And so we still have a lot of work with this report to break it down. And if businesses are finding it a challenge to understand it, we should know that for communities, they are dealing with climate change the best way that they know. They are dealing with climate change by looking at how their crop turns out at the end of every season. They're dealing with climate change by looking at how pasture for their livestock has changed over time. And when they see a certain weed overtaking, this is their language of climate change. How can we make them? How can we then integrate science? Because we know science is important, but there's a lot of science in indigenous knowledge as well, right? There's a lot of science in fact, we say that indigenous knowledge is the science of local people. Right, so they have a science. Within it is built how they live, how they interact with nature and places. And this is very, very important for us not to forget, because if businesses are busy doing stuff without them, tourism businesses, especially those who are in nature tourism, without an understanding, integrating the local communities to have an understanding and a place on the table. Not just, I'm sorry, I'm going to use these words and they might sound a little hard, but there is something that we are observing in the South. And I'm talking about it, not just here, but I'm very vocal about it. There's something that I call predatory financing in climate, where there are a number of organizations that are raising a lot of money and it's coming to places that are vulnerable in the name of places that are vulnerable. raising a lot of money and coming to these places and engaging in projects and initiatives without consultation. They are using science, they are bringing scientists from outside, they are collecting data, they are writing reports, they are raising money and saying, we're going to do climate projects. What is a climate project? I have asked this. What is a climate project, right? How does a climate project look like for host communities? They're coming in with a lot of climate projects, coming in with a lot of science, equipment, and everything. But when they leave with everything because they report back to whoever received the proposal and gave the funding. They're not reporting back to the communities. And this is the disconnect of green financing or climate financing today. There's a huge disconnect because you cannot be talking about green financing for communities when it is all external. And so we must also be careful in the tourism industry not to fall victim of this predatory financing that is predating on the vulnerability of places and communities without making significant difference on the ground. Even the basic warning systems, the integration of indigenous knowledge and science to just put up a basic climate warning center that is based on indigenous knowledge that is managed by the local people, other than all the time talking above the heads of local communities and places. Yeah, and so a climate action should not be seen as another form of this what I call the savior. We're coming in to save the people. No, the people need to know what they need. You cannot save a people who don't know that you're trying to save them and how you're trying to save them, right? So this report is a brilliant start for the tourism industry, but how it is used will be important. And it is my honest prayer that we or the industry does not fall big time of this space of predatory fundraising for climate action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. Because of time, I'm going to give 30 seconds for Amanda, Gopi, Judy, and then I'm gonna leave the last words for Bobby. So Amanda, good last message, 30 seconds, if you can share with us.
Well, certainly, I would like to thank the Travel Foundation for the very important work in both the drafting of the Climate Action Plan, and just to say that from the Caribbean perspective, we are encouraging all of our member countries to sign on to the declaration, that is the tourism authorities, and to effectuate their climate action plans. Definitely it is an emergency for the region and certainly priority moving forward. So I think the study will provide an additional knowledge tool or knowledge product that can enhance our preparedness efforts broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Gopi.
Well, I am currently working on, I've just shared the information in the chat for everybody to see, trying to build a platform to bring together the humanitarian development tourism sector, on a common platform in such a way that next time another disaster happens, we should be able to activate our mechanism, of the first response, but in the same time, work during the mitigation and preparedness on how to build what we call as a climate resilient and climate responsible destination. Anywhere in the world, I believe in the future, if you are going to focus on a destination, because there's a lot of talk about climate action in tourism, but we need to start looking at everything from the destination perspective. A destination that has tourism is one of the game, but there are people, there are community, there are so many other things, So basically the people and places story, from that. So if you could log into that kaita.org. It's just a one-page website right now, and just sign in there and let us know if you are interested to help us put this together. Try out few live labs. That'll be wonderful. Right now, I am like desperately looking for money, people, resources, but I decided that I am going to work only on this in the next 5-6 years to make this happen. So please, we need everybody's support.
Thank you so much, Gopi. Judy.
Thank you so much. I think my final remarks relate to what everyone else has said. I think no one should be left behind in this agenda. We should also start in climate action. We should start talking about what I've been raising recently. Probably my most recent area of interest is the shift from best practices to valuable practices. And in climate action, we must be able to distinguish what is best practice and what is valuable practice. Now, if you ask me, in my own definitions, how I look at good practices and best practices and valuable practices, for me, best practices are good for the business. Valuable practices are good for people and planet. And valuable practices transcend seasons, and they are most importantly transferable, which means you can copy them because of the way that they have a method. They are very clear. They're not the copy-paste thing that everybody does. So we must move into valuable practices that are replicable, that are valuable, that bring value to people and the planet, and not just make the businesses look good. So yes, great report. We have a resource going forward, but yeah, tourism. Let's not make this something to make our businesses profitable, but something valuable for people and planet as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, Gopi, Judy, for those inspiring words. And I'd like to leave the last words for someone who I think is personally involved with this more deeply than any of us. And we experienced many things together, Bobby, doing this report, traveling to San Pedro de Atacama, looking at the lithium mining, looking at tourism in lithium mining. And I think it's a wonderful invitation to start talking beyond carbon when we work and do and talk about climate action. It's way beyond just carbon. It's about people, it's about nature, animals, it's about all of us. And I'd like to leave the last remarks to you, Bobby.
Thank you so much for that, Marco. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the call and everyone who's tuned in today. It's just been a real honor to be part of this project. And it has been just really a journey of constant learning. You know, I can't, I'd be lying if I said that this was easy. This was actually being part of this project. You know, as we've talked about, these conversations that are really part of meaningful inclusion and collaboration, they're difficult. This is not something that's easy. It's not a box ticking exercise. And to be very honest, when I was first approached about being part of this conversation, I didn't even know that I belonged, that my voice was appropriate in this. You know, I come from more a background of community-led tourism and indigenous-led tourism. I didn't feel that I knew about the carbon or climate science. But it really is, and I love what Judy had said of that, you know, tourism can't do this alone, and we can't leave anybody behind. And I think that when we really take that on board as a starting point, we start to see that what we're all talking about is not just changing and reimagining tourism, but fundamentally on a very deeper human level. I think reimagining and reapproaching how we even view the world, how we view our place in it, and how we are able to take care of one another, the human, the non-human, and beyond. And so I think that this is fundamentally what we're starting to get at, is even beyond tourism and travel. You know, how do we reimagine our place in this world that's hurting due to our actions, but that does have a capacity to heal. So with that, thank you to everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you all, and thank you especially to tourism cares and crises that weren't able to be here, but they were very important for the report as well. Thank you, everyone. We are going to share this recording, and you can download the report also in a very romantic language as Spanish. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day, night, evening, afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.